Pessoal, legal. Bom, bem-vindos e bem-vindas, em primeiro lugar. É um prazer estar fazendo essa aula conjunta aqui com a professora Raquel. A gente planejou algumas atividades juntos aí ao longo do semestre. Então, essa é a primeira delas. Que bom que está funcionando. A gente teve uma logística aí para organizar com as professoras também de Direito do Trabalho. Mas a gente quer... Enfim, a gente está conduzindo 2 cursos em paralelo, mas a gente quer que esses cursos se conversem também. Então, essa é a primeira oportunidade que a gente está tendo para fazer isso. E a gente está tendo um grande prazer aqui também de receber o professor Renato Nazzini. E eu vou mudar para o inglês agora para apresentá-lo. Ele vai apresentar em inglês também e a gente depois vai ter oportunidade de fazer perguntas e respostas que podem ser em inglês ou em português e a gente traduz. Então, fiquem super à vontade aí também, tá bom? Antes de mais nada, deixa eu ler um disclaimer aqui que é obrigatório para todos os eventos que a gente está gravando. E só para que a gente deixe isso registrado, as manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, no caso eu e Raquel aqui, e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online, representam exclusivamente as opiniões de seus autores e não necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes concordam em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e com isso autorizam o uso de seu nome, voz e imagem, além de ceder os direitos autorais patrimoniais relativos à exposição para sua transmissão, que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais da FGV. Para seguir com essa transmissão, pedimos que se manifestem verbalizando ou sinalizando a sua concordância. Então, nós concordamos com isso. Muito obrigado. I'll shift to English now. I'd like to thank Professor Renato Nazzini, an old friend of FGV. Professor Renato has been here other times, especially at the Global Law Program in 2020, teaching a short-term course. And now he's visiting Brazil again, and he gave us an honor to give a lecture about artificial intelligence, algorithms, and competition law. And I think this is a hot topic today. There's a lot going on. We're going to talk about competition law further down the road in our courses, but I think it's a very important and interesting issue. And having Professor Renato Nazzini here is a great pleasure, so we thought we could anticipate this discussion here. Professor Renato Nazzini is a professor at King's College London, where he leads the LLM and competition law, and he's also a partner at LMS, a law firm, where he deals with antitrust in the UK, in Italy, and in the European Union. So he's both leading academic in the field and also leading practitioner in the field. So I think it's quite interesting for us to have the opportunity to have a dialogue with him. So without further ado, thank you very much, Renato, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. It's a very great pleasure to be here in São Paulo again after 3 years now. It's about 3 years since 2020. So what I was planning to do is to present, in fact, a paper on which I'm working with my colleagues James Henderson on algorithmic collusion and computational antitrust. What does that mean, really? So what are we talking about? Because I understand that not all of you are very advanced now in your competition studies, if I understood it correctly, right? So let me make kind of general introduction to the topic. So first of all, we are talking about artificial intelligence, okay? And when we talk about artificial intelligence today, so what's happening now, we are obviously not talking about, let's say, Terminator, right? We are not talking about a robot who can perform all human functions and is also self-aware of himself or herself. This is still not our reality. Maybe in the future, as neural networks develop and become more and more complex, some scientists are very confident that they will happen, but we are not there yet, okay? And we are also not talking about general AI, which would be a robot that performs all the functions of a human being, short of being self-aware. What we are talking about, algorithms that perform one specific task. But they perform that specific task in a way which is autonomous, with a certain degree, or sometimes with a significant degree, or complete autonomy even, from any human input or human supervision. And we are talking about, particularly today, pricing algorithms. Okay, so pricing algorithms are algorithms that set prices of goods and services. And basically, they are today really pervasive. So particularly in the e-commerce sector, for example, the European Commission that carried out a market study on e-commerce found that the majority of online retailers track the online prices of their competitors, and 2/3 of those competitors use automated pricing, so pricing algorithms. Again, studies that have been conducted on the Amazon marketplaces, and this is, for example, there is a study in 2016. So in terms of the use of these algorithms, this is really a very early stage, almost prehistory, but out of about 1,500 of the best selling companies, suppliers on Amazon Marketplace, 500 used automated pricing software, so pricing algorithms. And they were the most successful retailers out of this sample. Recently, also the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK has carried out a study and has produced a report, and has found that large Amazon sellers, or Amazon sellers that have more than 1 million in revenue, consider automated prices or pricing algorithms essential. Why do we use these pricing algorithms, and why are they essential, and in which markets do we use them? Obviously not if, or certainly not yet, when you want to purchase your home, your flat, you want to sell your flat, etc., or when you want to purchase a particularly nice painting that you want to hang in your living room. When are they used? Well, they are used particularly for services or products, the price of which is very variable and really varies or may vary a lot depending on the customer, but that price setting can be based on available data. So think about insurance, for example, right? Or loan markets. Okay, so an insurance premium depends on lots of circumstances. I mean, whether it's health insurance, liability insurance, etc. But as long as there are those data and those data are available, an algorithm can set that price. Or prices that are relatively prices in relation to which the marginal cost, or more generally the cost of supply, is relatively stable, but there are huge changes in demand. Okay, so for example, hotel bookings, airline prices, and products sold on online marketplaces and e-commerce, obviously. So these are really, the sectors where currently you have algorithmic prices. And algorithmic pricing is, of course, very useful because it matches more closely supply and demand, and it responds to demand in a way that traditional pricing set by human beings cannot really do. I mean, the data that you see is quite amazing, really. So, how many times prices, for example, change in one day on Amazon in relation to certain products, tens of times, some on certain occasions in relation to certain products. So you wouldn't be able to do that with human input. And I don't know how much you have also covered in terms of economics, but of course, the more, I mean, generalizing, I know this is being recorded, so I mean, this is a generalization, but of course, the more closely supply and demand match, the more closely supply can adapt to demand, the better the allocation of resources in relation to that particular market. So there is clearly an efficiency here. Customers are better served and suppliers sell more and make more profit, which is essentially a functioning economy. However, we should also be aware here of the risk of supra-competitive prices and particularly the risk of cartels. Now, a cartel is an agreement or an understanding whereby competitors, instead of competing, and therefore, generally, when you compete, what do? You offer a better price to the customer to win her custom. So a better price is, of course, a lower price. One competes also on service, on quality. Obviously, that's the other element on of competition. But if you think about, you know, the old-fashioned cartels, let's say, you know, vitamins, cement, wood pulp, right? So pretty homogeneous products, very few producers who then met and decided to put prices up rather than competing on lowering their prices. Traditional cartels. Now, when it comes to e-commerce, for example, and algorithmic pricing, traditionally, you know, consumer goods where you have many suppliers, so I don't know, posters sold, you know, now they are sold on Amazon, for example. But say sale of posters with, you know, particular topic like you know, sports or music or whatever. These are generally difficult products to cartelize because there are many suppliers. You know, there are not 3 or 4 suppliers of posters as there were suppliers of maybe cement or vitamins. There are hundreds of them. The products are also very much differentiated. People like different things, sport, music, the poster for a particular sporting event, which was held, you know, on a particular day, etc., maybe much more valuable than others, and so on and so forth. So these are lots of suppliers and potentially also differentiated products. So it's very difficult for human beings to cartelize these markets. It's basically almost impossible or impossible. Algorithmic pricing changes these dynamics because an algorithm can do exactly what a human being does. So looks at the prices of all the posters and looks at demand, how many people want these posters, etc. Looks at all the competitors and sets a price, right? But it can do it in a way that human beings cannot do it. So it can look at 1 million prices in, you know, the prices of 1 million products in half a second, right? And that would take one of us weeks and weeks and weeks. It would be a pointless exercise. So they are very efficient, these algorithms, and the market, especially online markets, are much more transparent. So it's not like selling vitamins in the 60s and in the 70s. There were private contracts between the pharmaceutical companies and the customers, etc. All the prices are online. So all the prices can be observed immediately in real time. And so an algorithm which is programmed and set to maximize profits will or may learn that actually to maximize profits, there are two strategies. You can try and give the customers the best price, the lowest price, maximizing therefore revenue and maximizing therefore quantity, or you can agree, collude with other suppliers to push prices up. You sell less, but you make much more profits. A cartel profit is obviously higher than the profit in a market that is competitive, where suppliers compete on time, and that's the risk basically that has been identified. Now, you may say, well, let's tell the algorithms not to make cartels, right? Not to do that, and this is potentially a solution. Certainly, I was saying earlier, you know, one proposal in the European Union in relation to artificial intelligence more generally is for high-risk artificial intelligence always to have human oversight. But this will be artificial intelligence that impacts on fundamental rights, on health, on social inclusion or social exclusion, not just pricing, because it would be really very inefficient and basically defeats the purpose of these algorithms to impose on suppliers human oversight of all these pricing decisions. That would be then no point. We could revert back to the past. And also there is another problem here, which is that there are various types of algorithms. Certainly, there are algorithms that are so-called rule-based. So and they perform what we call supervised learning. So there is an element not of human oversight in the sense that the human checks every pricing decision, but what the algorithm does depends on the input and instructions given by a human being, by the owner, the operator of the algorithm. So, for example, you can set an algorithm by saying, you know, you always have to undercut the buy box price on Amazon until we get the buy box place ourselves, right? So you give that rule to the algorithm, and the algorithm performs that. But there are also and potentially much more useful in practice, algorithms which are unsupervised and algorithms which are so-called deep learning algorithms. So these will just have an objective, which is maximizing profits or maximizing revenues, and the algorithm will learn itself by trial and error how to do it. And because of the kind of neural networks and the layers around which the algorithm is structured, we will know the input, maximize price, maximize revenues, or maximize profits in the long term and over a year, etc. And we will know the output, so the input goes on the first layer, and these algorithms have at least 4 layers, and then there will be an output, which will be a price. You know, this poster now, you know, I'm selling it at X, but we don't know how the algorithm has reached the decision to charge that price. Deep learning machines, deep learning algorithms, and basically algorithms can therefore learn effectively to agree with each other, to collude with each other in setting prices at the cartel level rather than at the competitive level. And that would be perfectly fine from the algorithm's perspective, because the algorithm has in that way achieved its objective to maximize indeed profit. I mean, a cartel is a rational strategy when it is possible. Of course, the algorithm may also, as human beings, cheat on the cartel, because sometimes in a cartel, it may be profitable and it may be therefore a good thing to make the cartel in the first place. Or let's all price at 100, but then you deviate and you put the prices down 90, 80. So you steal a lot of business from your competitors, and you maximize your profits in that way by maximizing quantity. What does a cartel do in this case? First of all, it has to detect the cheater. If it's private contracts, it's not easy. If these are contracts that are confidential between vitamin suppliers and retailers, etc., that's more difficult to. You can observe maybe by looking at downstream prices, etc., but you can get market intelligence. You can see your prices, your revenues affected. You can get information from buyers who tell you, well, there is one competitor who is one of your competitors who is giving us better prices, but it's not so easy, and it may take a little bit of time. Once you have detected the cheating, then the cartel may react and undercut the price of the cheater. So if the cheater is pricing at 90, then the cartel will price at 80, destroy all its profit until that company comes back into the cartel. Now, in real kind of brick and mortar traditional cartels, cement, wood pulp, chemicals, etc., that is difficult, takes time. These punishing mechanisms may or may not work, but you can see how this changes with algorithmic pricing as well, because the algorithm can detect immediately whether a competitor is cheating on this understanding, so it's going down in prices, can detect whether these lower prices really depend on a drop in demand or even drop in costs, or actually it's a price war. It can immediately react in terms of undercutting. So there is also a theory that algorithmic pricing can make this collusive outcome more stable because of the transparency of the market, the ease of detection, and the ease and immediacy of the punishment. Now, let's look a bit of the theory, and then at the theory, and then what happens in practice. So, what is the theoretical problem that you face in relation to these collusive algorithms? The problem that you face is that our competition law, as you will find out in due course, of course, prohibits these things, right? Prohibits cartels, anti-competitive agreements, but you need an agreement, okay? So you need a meeting of minds, says the European jurisprudence. It doesn't have to be a formal contract, obviously. It can be purely verbal. It can also be an exchange of information. It can also be, a competitor telling another competitor, next week I am putting prices up by X, and the other competitor saying, well, I'm doing the same, or saying nothing, but just doing it. That's also illegal. certainly under European competition law, but I guess also under Brazilian, I mean, maybe also under Brazilian competition law for sure, but you need some kind of either agreement or contact between human agents. And sometimes this works also in relation to algorithmic pricing. I mean, there have been I mentioned posters as an example earlier, and I didn't do it by chance because there have been cases in the UK and in the US in relation to algorithmic pricing on Amazon for the sale of posters, right? And the way the cartel, let's say, worked is the way it worked in by using a so-called rule-based algorithm. So the cartelists, the suppliers said, look, we set our algorithms so that we don't undercut each other. We compete with the other suppliers, and if the other suppliers they are charging lower prices, etc., we will charge low prices as well. But if the other suppliers are not supplying competing products or are out of the market momentarily, etc., then we will not undercut each other. And they set the algorithms to do that. Okay, so it's still algorithmic pricing. It's still a case in which you can do something more sophisticated than you could do before, because it's pretty clear that if we didn't have these algorithms, a cartel like this wouldn't work, right? Because how can you in real time monitor all the poster prices on Amazon and change your prices accordingly and see whether you should go down or not compete with your fellow cartelists? It's impossible. So the algorithm really made the cartel possible, which would not have been possible in the past. But from a legal perspective, there was human agreement. So there was absolutely no problem as a matter of law in concluding that that was a cartel, and in fact has been prosecuted and punished as a cartel. The problem that you have instead is the problem with these deep learning algorithms. These algorithms that only have an objective. So I'm not telling the algorithm, do not undercut my competitor because we have made a cartel agreement. You just tell the algorithm, I want to earn as much money as possible on the sale of these products, which is perfectly legitimate. I mean, that's what competition is about. That's what a market economy is about. And the algorithm, together with the other algorithms, maybe by trial and error, putting pricing down, putting pricing up, putting pricing at the kind of mid-level, following demand, etc., they realize that actually the way of making the most money is to have a cartel price. But that would not be a cartel under the current law, because there is no meeting of minds, there is no exchange of information between competitors. It's purely machine caused. And that poses a problem, because even in relation to softwares, I mean, there has been a case, Ituras in the European Court of Justice, where which was about the use of a software by travel agents and a system run by a trade association, effectively, and the message was sent and the restriction introduced so that the travel agents would not apply certain discounts. And some travel agents said, well, but we didn't look at that message. You know, it just went into the inbox, but we were not aware of it. yes, we are part of this software system and these communication systems, but we have nothing to do with this message. And actually the Court of Justice agreed and said, yes, we need at least the awareness of the company, the awareness of the person receiving this message, receiving this input. Now, this was not algorithmic pricing, but the test, I emphasize that again, is still awareness. And so, for example, there has been a study by the French Competition Authority and the German Competition Authority, and they also distinguish between situations where at least competitors knowingly coordinate, maybe through a third parties, but they do that with awareness, and situations in which they are not aware and could not reasonably foresee it, which really fall outside the scope of our prohibitions at the moment. Then you need here to rethink the rules of attribution of liability, but this is very difficult, because then you would impose liability on companies for behavior and conduct that they cannot effectively control, because the algorithm is completely autonomous. Now, you can say, well, the algorithm shouldn't be completely autonomous, there should be human oversight, but then in relation to pricing, as I said, you effectively lose the efficiency of using the machine. You lose that efficiency. And we know that most likely, in very many circumstances, algorithmic pricing is efficient, is good for the economy, is not bad for the economy. So in order to prevent these possible cartels, then you destroy essentially a tool which is very, very, very useful in e-commerce, in insurance, in hotel bookings, etc. You can do that. I mean, for example, very recently, the Italian government, I mean, you know the geography of Italy, and there are a few islands around, obviously, and people have to fly, you know, to go from Sardinia or Sicily to the mainland, and there was a concern that with this algorithmic pricing, at times of peak demand, etc., the fares were extremely expensive. And actually, Italy passed the law that prohibits algorithmic pricing in certain circumstances in relation to these particular flights. So it's a very narrow category, but you can't do it across the economy, because you would, as I said, destroy those efficiencies. What can you do? Therefore? Well, there are some solutions. Or potential solutions. For example, because these algorithms, you can run so-called empirical audits on the algorithms. I mean, the beauty of algorithms is they are, once you give an input, they don't have to function necessarily in the real world. You can give them inputs and data and see how they behave in an experiment, if you want. So that's called empirical audit. This has been used already by the European Commission in the Google shopping case. I'm sure there has been a Google shopping case in Brazil as well, as I mean, in every country in the world. I mean, so in the European Google shopping case, and I don't know, maybe Kaji did the same thing, the Commission was able to run an empirical audit of the algorithm, and with inputting the search words, and observing that indeed, compared to a normal situation, Google shopping products were treated more favorably. So that's called empirical audit. So you can, for example, impose as a condition of using pricing algorithms, you can impose on producers, those who design these algorithms, or you can impose on those who use the algorithms. That's a policy choice, and there are pros and cons. You can impose on them to run tests, to run empirical audits before using the algorithm to see whether they tend to achieve a collusive outcome, a cartelized outcome or not. So checking that in advance, so to speak. When it comes to when it comes to really observing what's happening in the real world, there are some studies, and that's why I was saying at the beginning, we should be now careful, perhaps not to overemphasize this problem and not to come to the conclusion that we should ban all pricing algorithms, because there are certainly some studies, which are, however, quite narrow, that come to the conclusion that, yes, this is a real concern. So we should really think about it. We are not thinking about nothing. On the other hand, we don't really have vast, robust, systematic, empirical evidence that tells us that this is a widespread issue. And this is, I think, what we should try and achieve in the next few years. And the reason for doing that is because if we want to make new laws, these new laws must be based on empirical evidence and on sound analysis, not just perceptions or academic concerns. And the second, and the only reason, the only way in which we can achieve that, or competition authorities can achieve that, is of course to use other algorithms to detect potential problems. Because of course, there is absolutely no point in any case handlers or competition officials trying to understand how this algorithmic pricing works. So you really have to use, or competition authorities have to use, algorithms, detection algorithms to analyze online pricing and see whether there might be a problem or not. Now, there are at least two issues when it comes to that. The first is that now we are talking about the detection algorithms, right? The good algorithms that help competition authorities like CAGI to see whether there is something dodgy going on the market online. So these algorithms, as the pricing algorithms, will only be able to detect, let's call it cartels or collusive outcomes, cartelized outcomes, if they have data on which they can learn to distinguish what is a cartelized or a collusive outcome and what is a competitive outcome. And this is quite difficult. I mean, we have data in relation to past cartels, but and so this can be certainly used. I mean, there are now, in Europe, 50 years, and in the United States much longer, even in Brazil. There are lots of countries now with competition regimes and cartel enforcement. So we have data in relation to these past cartels, but there are two problems with that. First of all, these are not online algorithmic pricing cartels. So there is a question as to whether the dynamics of, let's call them traditional cartels, the price dynamics and the price patterns that you can observe there are or are not the same as price patterns of collusive outcomes in algorithmic pricing. There are some, not very many, but some good studies on that that suggest similarities, economic studies and empirical studies that suggest some similarities, but not complete, not complete overlap, because algorithmic price is dynamically very different. And secondly, there is also another problem in relation to using data for past cartels, which is generally the cartels that are detected by competition authorities are a minority. There are estimates that say that the cartels that are detected and punished are between maybe 10% and 30% of the cartels that actually go on. And they are also, generally speaking, the weakest cartels, the cartels that break down, because most cartels are now detected through leniency applications, meaning that one of the cartels self-reports, goes to the competition authority, says, I'm making a cartel, puts its hands up, and gets away without a fine, although now they will then be the target of significant damages actions. But so there may be that problem. And actually, there is also a problem in relation to, so the algorithm needs quite a lot of data. It cannot, it has to observe quite a lot of non-cartelized or non-collusive pricing patterns and collusive pricing patterns. And so if you keep this exercise within a single jurisdiction, only Brazil, only Switzerland, only the UK, you probably don't have enough data to input into the algorithm in the first place. And remember, generally for these detection algorithms, you would need to give an initial input, because if you tell the algorithm simply, go on the marketplace, look at all prices and tell me which are cartels and which are not, then the algorithm doesn't know, right? They cannot learn it because you wouldn't be able to detect it by itself. So you need this initial input. So these detection algorithms, in other words, would be rule-based, supervised algorithms. And the data within an individual jurisdiction, I would suggest, is probably not enough. So you need, and competition authorities should pool together data in order to create large enough databases so that effective detection algorithms can be put in place. However, there is a difficulty with that as well. There has been a recent study that looked at Switzerland and Japan, and essentially putting together data of bids. So one of the types of market where this data is more readily available is tender markets, so bids for public contracts, for example, because there the public authorities have all the bid data. Of course, these are recorded over time and so on. So looking at, and the study looked at Japan and Switzerland and came to some interesting conclusions. Yes, the data can be used, can be pulled together, but you have to be also very careful, because for instance, one of the conclusions, and I oversimplify, of this study was that there is generally, even when the situation is competitive, in Japan, probably because of higher market transparency and so on, there is less variance in price. And that same variance in price in Switzerland can actually suggest, or can actually be consistent with the collusive outcome. Okay. In other words, this suggests that even in a completely competitive settings, Japanese producers may have better information on each other costs or on each other prices than the Swiss. Okay, so you really have to be, you can use this data, but you have to, from different jurisdictions, but you have to be very careful about these problems. And finally, and I think that my time is up. Yes, 40 minutes, we said. And another thing that we need, another thing that we need is really more empirical evidence. And therefore, I think the job for competition authorities is to carry out proper market studies. It's difficult. They would need detection algorithms to do that, but we need much more data. The studies nowadays are very few. They are very narrow in relation to very specific products or services. We really need to understand how pervasive or not this problem is in relation to online pricing. So competition authorities have a big job to do around the world to monitor these markets. Also in order then to, and that's my final point, to understand what are the pricing patterns online that are consistent or not with the cartel. Because we know there is here a lot of literature. We know what these pricing patterns in brick and mortar, let's put it this way, markets are. So, you can observe, for example, if you observe a period of very strong price volatility, prices going up and down, and then all of a sudden prices stabilize for a long period of time at the higher level. That's, of course, potentially consistent with the cartel if it's not caused by costs, for example, going up, if it's not caused by fluctuations in demand. If you sometimes you can observe prices that are very, very stable for a long period of time, and all of a sudden they drop and they become very volatile in response to entry by a new competitor. That's again maybe consistent with the cartel. So there is disruptive entry, someone who is pricing down, and therefore everybody's prices go down as well. And then you can have two different outcomes. Either the cartel breaks down completely and then you go towards a competitive market, or the new entrant is kind of brought into the cartel and prices go up again, and so on. There are various patterns that can be observed in traditional markets. Now we need to understand what are the patterns in online markets where algorithmic pricing is used. Otherwise, then as I said, the detection algorithm will not be able to make that distinction. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renato. This is very interesting. We're now open for questions so that we can have further discussion on this. As I said in the beginning, questions in Portuguese or English are fine. Renato also understands Portuguese really well, actually. So, Luisa? Please, we should speak here just because we have also members of Comppit, the Competition, Public Policy, Innovation and Technology Nucleus participating online. So if we can keep this conversation online, it's always good.
Thank you for your lecture. It was really nice to hear you. And one thing I was thinking about was eventually, when we have this data and when we have more research available for then we can map the levels of price variation, we could have in law maybe a type of measurement that will establish basically like when we have the lowest rate and when we have this kind of variation, then there will be the obligation of the competition authorities to start a more deep investigation and to look towards the case specifically more in a more deep way than it would normally make an investigation in the practice. So I think that eventually human action will really need to be something that will be regulated, and maybe that legislation would be important to establish those patterns and some limits that legally will bind and make it trigger a greater investigation of the system of pricing establishments.
Okay, no, thank you very much. That's a very good point. I agree with, basically I agree with you, except on one point. I agree with you because indeed, once we have this empirical evidence and analysis, we will be able, or competition authorities will be able to say, well, if I observe this price pattern, that's fine. If I observe that price pattern, that is potentially problematic. And I entirely agree with you. This is not to say it is certainly problematic, because I mean, you know, even with traditional cartels, which let's say are easier, it was never possible to just say, okay, this price is like this, it's a cartel, I fine you. If the prices are like this, it's not. You always have to look deeper. Before you had to look at meetings of competitors, emails, spreadsheets. Now you have to look at algorithms and you know, run these audits, maybe technical audits as well, and so forth. So definitely agree with you. The only thing that I'm not quite sure about, because you said there would be an obligation on the competition authority. Generally, certainly the trend internationally is to give competition authorities discretion, because obligations are quite dangerous in the sense that, you know, they work well in theory, in the sense that, oh, you know, why should the competition authority decide to investigate this and not that, if it's more or less the same situation, etc. But in reality, you know, think about algorithmic pricing, right? You know, what if there are today 100 instances of these anomalous prices? How can a competition authority have an obligation to look at all of them? I think competition authority should also always have a discretion in relation to the cases they look at. Of course, discretion doesn't mean, or should not mean, arbitrary discretion, or, you know, tossing a coin, or, you know, let's draw by lot, you know, which case we look at, or political influence or things like that. It should be a rational discretion, but should be a discretion.
Yeah, I think a part of that's happening in Brazil right now, but it's using algorithms to detect kind of like traditional cartels, right? In bid rigging, for instance. Mm-hmm. So CADE has this tool that's called the Brain Project that basically looks at large databases of bids and try to find patterns that look like something problematic is happening. And then they choose priorities and targets of investigations through partners. But then they look deeper to see if there is any human contact or meeting of minds happening there. So I think that's one way that this can happen. But it's really using algorithms to find traditional cartels. It's one level easier than using algorithms to find algorithmic cartels, right? So I think that's an issue as well. Other questions, comments?
I would like to know your opinion on how this algorithm detection affects the right to a company to defend itself, because it gives a very broad power for the agencies to investigate companies. And even the investigation itself can be very problematic to a private company. And I would like to your opinion on how this can be adapted to control this power of investigation that agencies might have, because in some cases, agencies can investigate a company for its business model, so to speak. I think the recent alterations in the German Antitrust Act, Section 19A, if I'm not mistaken, in my view at least, gives this sense that the company can, an antitrust agency can investigate a company without limits, so to speak. So I would like to know your opinion on that.
Well,
thank you.
I think my opinion is that a competition authority should always have kind of rational or reasonable ground. I mean, it depends. I mean, in some in some jurisdictions that is a test set in the law. In some other jurisdiction, it's not. But in principle, a competition authority should have reasonable grounds for launching an investigation. So it cannot be an arbitrary decision. So that's why I was saying, it's necessary to identify effective screens that tell us, as also Professor Caio was saying, is this pricing pattern really anomalous, so that it is justified to look at it in more detail, or not. And if it is justified, of course, there is a public interest that prevails over the private interest of the company to be left alone. I do see that there is a problem in any public investigation, really, not just competition investigations. I mean, you can be subject to a 3-4 years investigation by a competition authority, who then comes to the conclusion that there is no problem, right? So if you were in court, then you would get your costs. But because you face a public authority, you don't get your costs, certainly not in all jurisdictions I am aware of. But because that's a public interest decision, isn't it? I mean, there is a public interest in investigating practices that are potentially harmful to the economy. Now, the other side of the coin is, of course, is the rights of defense of the company. So the company has the right to defend itself, and so can put forward always, first of all, they have to know the case that is being brought against them. So what is the problem? Why are you concerned with my pricing practices? And therefore, even at an early stage, they can rebut that case and explain why there is no problem. That's also where I think compliance plays an important role. I mean, because if you have robust compliance, so for example, you have, and by compliance I don't just mean the piece of paper which is called compliance program, right? But if you have a strong compliance framework, you would, for example, have done something to check that these algorithms will not lead to collusion, or will not do anything which is a breach or exposes your company to problems. You have to do it anyway, because regardless of competition law, I think, because these algorithms can be even more problematic, can, for example, discriminate between people based on race or based on location where they live, and so on, can decide not to sell to anybody from a given neighborhood, because 70% of people in that neighborhood are from a particular, so you from a particular ethnic group. So you have to check, not just for competition law, that these algorithms comply broadly with the legal framework. And if you have done proper compliance, then it's easier to defend yourself in an investigation at an early stage and persuade the competition authority, look, there is no problem here. If you just buy an algorithm and you stick your head in the sand, so to speak, and let the algorithm do whatever it wants, then you are running a risk. I think you're running a significant risk. Now, I know this is not easy. I mean, this is technology that is still, it's not so new, but of course it's still, maybe difficult to understand, difficult to control, and but I think it's necessary. It's when when we invented cars, right? Motor cars, you didn't need a driving license. There wasn't a traffic code or whatever. There wasn't an exam, which now in the UK has become ridiculous, as I hear. I mean, it's more difficult than passing the competition law exam at King's to be able to drive a car. At the beginning, there was nothing. People just bought it and went around, land on somehow or whatever. Now, you need a driving license, you need an exam. I mean, 2 years, up to, for a number of years, you cannot drive a certain types of cars. There is lots of regulation of what you do, you cannot do on the roads. And I think it's the same thing here. It's a new technology. Now it's pretty unregulated, but it is something which is, I think, possibly as a motor car, very useful, but also potentially very harmful. I mean, a car can kill people, right? And so on. And so we will need a structure in place, competition law, but also kind of a ex ante framework to ensure that these algorithms are not harmful.
Hi, you can hear me?
Yes.
So I would like to bring up the matter of the objectives of antitrust law and how this relates to the pricing algorithms, because I think that hearing your lecture, I kept thinking about how these algorithms are changing several paradigms or premises that we refer to. For instance, exchanging information. We're talking about exchanging future information. And that's important because in brick and mortar settings, we need time to adapt our structures and reflect competition. The pricing algorithms are so instantaneous in their decision making that you don't need future information. You can have present information, and that's already impacting competition. And you also have the matter of you're not dealing with man-made decisions if you're talking about deep learning. And I think there is a discussion as to what extent this could be reasonably foreseen, but we're talking about algorithmic decisions. So how do you impose liability, so on and so forth. I wanted to focus on price discriminating and the ability that these algorithms have to perfectly or near perfectly price discriminate. And this is perceived as a very efficient way of dealing with pricing in economics. But I wonder to what extent we're prepared to accept this socially. I mean, Italy passed a law because they perceived that price discrimination in certain airplane trajectories are socially undesirable. And although this is economically efficient, how does the goal of antitrust law relate to this new challenge? Do you think we're prepared to deal with this under the current paradigm, or do you think about these topics?
Thank you. And that's a very important theme, actually. Let me say a few things. So first of all, just an observation on something that you said, which is very interesting. It's not an answer to the main question, but when you said, you made the distinction between current information and future information, that's very important. And for example, one of the patterns of potentially collusive pricing that has been identified in the limited literature, this is a very interesting paper, is basically because an algorithm cannot exchange future information, but what they can do is to send signals very, very quickly. So it's price signaling, up and down, up and down, up and down, within 30 minutes, within 1 hour, etc. And then that signals to the other algorithms what the prices can be. So it's all present, but it's present signaling, and then that can lead to a successful collusive outcome. But going to whereas price signaling in real traditional markets, I mean, it takes a long time, and it may or may not work, it may be misunderstood, and so on and so forth. Now, going to your main question. Now, well, the answer is a combination of antitrust and non-antitrust, because from the perspective of price discrimination, are we well equipped to deal with that? Yes and no. Price discrimination may be prohibited only if a company is dominant. So if any vendor on Amazon perfectly price discriminates, that's obviously not prohibited under the current framework. unless that vendor is dominant, but we can assume it is not. Now, currently, price discrimination under antitrust is not always good. I mean, so we are, I think, intellectually prepared to say that, you know, of course, perfect price discrimination by a monopoly is it's a perfectly efficient outcome, fundamentally. So it's one of the most efficient pricing models you can have, but it's an open question whether antitrust tolerates that or not. Probably not in Europe, I would say. But discrimination based on, let's say, what in the UK we would call protected characteristics, so race, religion, you know, gender, etc. That is, in my view, not an antitrust problem. It's a much more serious problem than any antitrust problem, but it's not an antitrust problem. And we do require regulation for that. I do think, I am an antitrust lawyer, but I do think that the more serious problems that AI raises are really not antitrust. I happen to be an antitrust lawyer, so that's why I talk about the antitrust problems, but there are much more fundamental problems. And, you know, one of those is discrimination based on, let's say, protected characteristics. And you need regulation for that. You need regulation for that, and because this should apply to everybody. I mean, it's you know, it cannot apply only to dominant companies. We have precedent for that because in non-online, you know, we already have rules in most jurisdictions, and I'm sure in Brazil as well, that prohibit discrimination based on protected characteristics. I mean, I know, you know, certainly in the UK, you know, even a business, not just the government, but even a business cannot, you know, decide, well, I only want Italians, right? And nobody else in this restaurant. So obviously not. So we have precedent for that, but we have to make rules for the online environment. In the European Union, there is now on the table an AI Act. It's a draft regulation, so it's not law yet. But the way it works is or it will work. I mean, it's still under discussion, and the Parliament has made a number of, has put forward a number of amendments. So we really don't know what the final text will be. But the way it works is to identify 4 categories of risk in terms of AI tools. And the highest risk is AI. It's about AI tools that indeed may have impact on health, may have impact on, and may have the potential to discriminate indeed based on a number of factors, etc. And these are the algorithms that will be subject to the strictest rules. And one of them is, for example, the requirement of human oversight. So there must be someone who oversees these algorithms, because we can just not run the risk of discrimination. I mean, we have, you know, fought for decades against forms of discrimination, and that cannot be reintroduced in the new kind of AI environment. So we need regulation. In short, I think we are culturally prepared for that. I think, well, I think it's a necessity. I think that's not an issue. I think intellectually or legally, our constitutions embed the principle of equality and non-discrimination. So the pillars are there. It's just a matter of how to implement it, which is not a small matter. It's quite a complicated matter, but it will have to be implemented, I think. And I think in Brazil as well, right, Caio, that there are proposals on the table. There's a project de lei.
Yes.
Yeah.
On different types of regulation platform.
Questions?
Hi, Professor. I'm not saying that this is necessarily realistic, but it was something that came up to me when I heard you speaking. If I understood correctly, you need to prove awareness in this type of situation when you have collision between algorithms. And one thing that came up to me is that if that situation doesn't create some sort of like incentive to especially markets that are very prone to collusion, when you have like few players and you have an homogeneous products and concentration, and this appliance of deep learning algorithms can be used as a way to reach collusion. And if that situation of like demanding and you have to prove awareness, this can like boycott the objectives of antitrust in that situation.
Yeah, no, yes, I think that's a real concern, and it's a very good point. You may have an incentive to use one of these deep learning algorithms, so then you say, well, there's nothing to do with me, actually. Now, there is another, so two observations to that. First of all, there is another test that can be used, which is a kind of test of negligence, if you want, in law. So was it reasonably foreseeable that by using that algorithm, there would be a collusive outcome? And of course, if it's a concentrated market, prone to collusion, maybe with a history of cartelization, and you put in a super algorithm and you tell the algorithm just maximize profits, you can argue, I mean, this is, there is no case yet, etc., but you can argue as a competition authority, you should have been aware of the risks. And therefore, it was reasonably foreseeable that there could be a cartel. If you have not done anything, then you are still liable. That's one possibility. The other possibility, I think, I mean, there is again in Europe on the table a draft, a 2022 draft of a AI liability directive. And the problem that, so it's not about antitrust, so it doesn't apply to antitrust as such, but applies to other harms caused by AI. Okay, so I drive the car and, it's the self-driving car, or I am driving with input from AI and, this causes an accident, or the AI makes recommendations in relation to medical treatment and, and that's harmful in the end. Of course, when we talk about AI, we are not talking about just pricing, we talk about everything. So harm caused by AI, and so the issue is to identify who is liable at the end of the day, and there are several options, but the point is you have to identify someone, and I think that's a good, well, again, this is a principle that is very much embedded in our law. I mean, I think there is nothing new about it. I mean, again, if you want to look at the history of the law, once upon a time, only those who sell you something, and if you had a contract, sale contract for a product, you could only sue if the product was defective, etc. in contract the seller, and then Donoghue and Stevenson, product liability, right? And then now we have pervasive regulation on product liability, different types of product, etc., etc. So again, nothing new here. You have something new, AI. We have to identify who is liable. The question, I think, will be more like whether it's a fault-based liability, whether it's a no-fault liability, whether no-fault liability should be limited only to certain circumstances or certain types of harm. But we need to have that discussion in competition law as well, I think, because I do think for deep learning algorithms, there is an issue currently. Unless you think, because unless, I mean, there is an issue. I think there is an issue. It's certainly an issue of lack of clarity. On the other hand, EU antitrust law is based on a principle of very strict principle of attribution to the company of acts of employees. So let's say if I am a very good company, I don't want to break the law, no cartels ever. I tell all my employees, don't do that. I put it in the contract, in the employment contract, you must comply with the antitrust code. If you don't, I fire you, because that's one of the most important things for me. I train them once a year, twice a year. I test them whether they have understood it. I audit from time to time, every year, etc., what they are doing, etc. In one of these audits, I discovered that one of these employees, maybe someone even more quite junior, without power to make decision on prices, has sent my future price list to a competitor. I am responsible. I am liable under EU law. Doesn't matter how much I have done. It doesn't matter that really I could not have prevented it. And once I have found out, I have immediately taken action. I am liable. Now, in a case like this, you can apply for leniency straight away. Hopefully, the cartel has been implemented, so there are no damages. So, compliance still works. But in law, you are liable for a cartel. Now, open question whether that could apply to an algorithm as well, to a machine as well. Well, you have made a cartel, it's your product, you are using that tool, this is it. If one of my machines, in the factory explodes, and causes harm, I am liable, unless, depending on, of course, the standard of liability under the applicable law. So I think there is, again, this is not tested, but we probably need some clarity, however, rather than leaving it to the first case. And then, and I think that's what's happening with all this regulation around the world.
Well, any last question? I think we're coming to an end here. Anyone? So I have one quick one that is, Renato, so you mentioned that in the regular world, we have meeting of minds and the brick and mortar as a very clear guideline in Europe. And I think in most jurisdictions, you need some type of human understanding to reach collusion, right? The issue is if there is no actual understanding in between algorithms and they're just maximizing individually and separately their own profits, just as humans are doing in many oligopolies, and reaching a price of equilibrium that is beyond the competitive price, right? It could be above the competitive pricing there. Is there anything different about algorithms that we should challenge that when algorithms reach that outcome, but we do not challenge when humans reach that outcome without any meeting of minds among them? So I think that's a big question mark in this whole discussion. I'm not sure how you see that.
Well, I think it depends on how, I think it depends on how big of a problem it is in practice, because I think one of the reasons, or maybe the main reason why we tolerate, like, say, purely tacit collusion, so is that, it's few markets, homogeneous oligopolies, maybe not very difficult to sustain. Yes, it goes on in some markets, but rather than say, well, we regulate all oligopolies, we just let it go, right? And because it's normal market functioning, maybe because there is no blame to be attributed, we tolerate it. Now, if, however, and we could come to the same conclusion in relation to algorithm in pricing. So if it is quite exceptional, only in certain markets, well, that's fine, right? And that's why I think we need more research and more analysis. If, however, we all of a sudden realizes that what was happening in the old economy in maybe, I don't know, let's pick a figure, like 3% of markets or 5% of the economy, right? Which was affected by tacit collusion, all of a sudden is 40% of the economy. Then I think we have a problem. It's not necessarily even a cartel problem, etc. And again, maybe it's regulation that, has to come in, and maybe these algorithms have to be designed in a way to avoid that. So they have to be rule-based algorithm designed to avoid that. But then I do think we would have a problem, because all of a sudden all prices would be much higher. And you would have oligopolistic prices in 40% of the economy instead of 3% of the economy. If it's still 3% of the economy, I agree. There is no way, there is no reason to depart from the traditional approach.
Thank you very much. I think this was very helpful. Thank you all. And we're certainly going to pick up on this and discuss cartel and how the law deals with cartel in our course. So thank you, Renato, for coming and for meeting our students.
Thank you very much.
We need the lists, as listas aí. Obrigado. Obrigado, pessoal. Nos vemos segunda-feira. Tchau, tchau. Thank you all.